Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. Welcome back to Drezburt, the last Drezburt of 2015.
Woo!
How the hell did that happen? I'm Heather Hurlburt, Director of the New Models of Policy Change Program at New America.
And I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post.
And I devoutly hope that maybe by the time you are watching this, we will be out of Trump mania phase, although I suppose that's unlikely. So
yeah, that's not going to happen.
I have been making the case all over Twitter and in a piece on Vox that there is a Trump effect. It is real. It is already happening. And actually, surprisingly enough, that effect is going to be most pronounced in the national security and the broader national security to include immigration and social solidarity policy arena.
All right. Hit me with your hypothesis. I will say this as someone who has certainly zero love for Donald Trump or his rhetoric, but still remains unconvinced that he's actually going to win anything, and therefore 6 months from now, hopefully, we will be in a situation where we can look back on this and laugh.
Right. Well, unfortunately, he doesn't have to win anything.
Okay.
So, first category of effect, we've seen the FBI has statistics showing that hate crimes against Latinos have gone up, I believe it's 50% over the last couple of years as sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric has heightened. So
Okay.
we do know that just in general, the worse the rhetoric there, there's this, we ought to have a conversation about these issues. It's good to be talking about them. Well, actually, unfortunately, the more we have the kind of conversation in which some people with big public megaphones are saying bigoted things, real people get hurt. So we don't have numbers for the second half of this year yet, but just anecdotally, you're seeing a really frightening spike in, mistreatment of American Muslims. And, just things that I, as a parent and a human being, find really horrifying, like kids' teachers trying to pull their headscarves off, asking them if they're terrorists, just all kinds of things that nobody wants to see happening that unfortunately.
My personal favorite in the anecdotal category is always the flight attendants. They're the worst.
Oh, God. Yeah.
The ways in which flight attendants will say, no, you can't fly just for no reason whatsoever.
Right.
Because they look vaguely Muslim. But go ahead.
If the number of times in my job, if I could have said to people, I'm not dealing with you because you make me uncomfortable. Yeah, I wouldn't have a job anymore, but never mind. So, just at the purely human level, there's really not any question that then you've seen, people beat up at Trump's rallies, frankly, idiots who were idiots anyway, going out and beating up, homeless Hispanic people and saying, oh, this is for Donald Trump.
Oh, right. There was that case in Boston, actually, a couple of months ago.
So there's no question that there's been an uptick in that, and the data at the end of the year are going to show it. Now, that matters because I want to live in a country where my neighbors also feel safe walking around. But there's been a really interesting study actually done out of Israel that came out recently that the more the American Muslim communities that experienced more hate crimes tended to produce less assimilated residents. So actually this sort of spewing of hate works just the way ISIS or whomever wants it to work.
That it forces Muslim communities in the United States to turn inward rather than try to integrate.
Yes. So you're producing, by having a spell of rhetoric like this, an effect that'll be felt for quite a bit longer than after Donald Trump, God willing, leaves the scene. So that's effect number one, and it's non-trivial. Just as someone who wants to live here.
Okay, so let me again. First of all, in some ways, we're actually replaying a debate that I believe Nate Silver and Dave Weigel had a week or two ago about the relevance of reporting on Trump.
Yep.
In which Silver's argument is essentially, look, Trump is not going to win. We have enough political science to suggest that it's extremely low probability, and yet Trump has gotten a disproportionate share of the media coverage. Indeed, if you compare, for example, Trump's, polling performance with, let's say, Bernie Sanders is actually getting more support even though he's losing that race. And yet the media coverage is just wildly disproportionate. And therefore, why is that the case? And I believe Weigel's response is essentially your response. And I think it's a valid one, which is to say, look, even if Donald Trump does not win, this is an important story. And, even if he's a losing campaign, it's a losing campaign, then it's an important losing campaign, because it has real world effects. Yeah.
So then effect number two is that Trump saying,
wait, hold on. I want to rebut though a little bit. Not in the sense of, I take all of your data, but I would say two things on this. The first is that as you point out, the very increase in sort of hate crimes against Latinos far precedes Trump. So, this is not, it's not like Trump came in de novo and suddenly, ginned up this kind of resentment. This resentment has been low-lying in the United States for quite some time, which then leads to the next argument, which is to say Trump is not the first candidate to prey upon this kind of nativist rhetoric. Think David Duke and Pat Buchanan in 1992, for example. That's the one that sort of comes to mind. So I guess my question is, the one slight difference about Trump, you could say, is that he's the front runner or he's viewed as the front runner, as opposed to some of these previous, George Wallace type candidates that were able to speak about this. But I don't know if that's a significant enough effect. And then the other thing, or think about Michelle Bachmann, for example, in 2012. And the other thing is that if we take the snapshot right now, I understand your concern. The interesting question is that if Trump flames out, does that then wind up dampening the very effect that you're talking about? In other words, is this a permanent scar or as opposed to a sort of cut that will eventually heal itself?
Right. Well, that actually leads right to my second argument, which is the fact that Trump is the front runner. Right. And that the Republican Party has been so slow and so late and so spotty in disavowing the most extreme things that he says, that he, if you look at the proposals of Ted Cruz and others, everyone has now forgotten that there were proposals to only let Syrian Christians into the country, to impose a religious test.
Jeb Bush did that, yeah, exactly.
Bush did that, but nobody, that's not interesting to talk about anymore. So
it's the shift in the Overton window, I think, is what the Republicans like.
So Trump is shifting the Overton window. And here I think, it was Weigel who wrote this, that the Wallace comparison is what I worry about, right? Like Wallace ran 4 times and was never elected.
Right.
But, there's no question that Wallace getting out in public and saying what he said, and it being clear to party elders that Wallace represented a chunk of opinion that they wanted to keep in the party, that changed American politics for the long term. And I don't know.
Well, wait a minute. I mean, hold it. In fact, Democrats wound up not keeping Wallace as part of the party in the Democratic Party. I mean, that chunk of the party switched from essentially Democrat to Republican. So, and it switched as a sort of strong, unified swath. I mean, to go back to something you suggested a minute ago, the message that came out of the George Wallace experience was not, these opinions are so toxic that you, white working folks from the South, should go home and change them. The message was, you need to find a better home for those opinions, and oh, look, we found one. So this is my worry about the trial. Look, I mean, you're absolutely right that people, and interestingly, the refugee community, the refugee advocacy community had been warning for months that this kind of backlash was coming. And I have to say, I didn't take it seriously enough in retrospect when I talked to my colleagues who work in those agencies, and I just thought, no, we can handle it. But, it was out there. Trump didn't invent it. Trump is taking advantage of it because he's very clever that way. Mm-hmm. But exactly where does that energy go? And if the energy, I mean, actually, that's a great, sort of interesting analogy. If the energy that was pent up by George Wallace ended up sort of resolving itself by sort of shearing off of one political party and cleaving to the other, what's the place that this energy goes, assuming that Republicans are able to tamp it down and nominate somebody who doesn't go. It's not overtly racist / fascist.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's 2 possibilities here. The first is that depending on how this plays out, at this point, it would not shock me if Donald Trump decides to run as a third party. In other words, all right, so hold on, let me step back. I am premising this on the notion that whatever energy that it seems like Trump has actually developed, it will actually not wind up going to Trump once people actually have to vote. My suspicion is it'll shift to Cruz somewhat, and or those people will not vote. In other words, that all of the polling suggests that Trump's support is coming from people who do not ordinarily vote. And I am still extremely dubious that these people are actually going to go to an Iowa caucus and actually vote. And then, similarly in New Hampshire, depending upon what happens in Iowa, it would not shock me if you see shifts away from Trump. So my prediction is this will play out like in a Howard Dean style scenario, in that it looks like he's the front runner right up until the moment that he isn't. But that said, assuming that's the case, where do I think this energy goes? I suspect one of a few things is possible. The first is that Trump decides to run as a third party. He thinks he's screwed over by the process, and then he winds up essentially being a Ross Perot of the racist crowd, which is great for Hillary Clinton, very bad for the Republicans for this cycle, and in the long term, possibly still good for the country in the sense of Trump will not do terribly well in that scenario, and that actually makes me feel good. The other thing that can happen is that the energy literally dissipates, which is to say Trump has mobilized a certain section of the population that actually really does not like politics, period. These people ordinarily do not vote. If Trump does not do terribly well, they will simply not vote again, or continue to not vote. In which case their effect on American politics is much less than would appear to be now.
So this is where I really part company with the sort of Trump doesn't matter school, because if we have something like, I'm just going to make up a number, 20% of our voting age population that feels like Trump represents their scream of frustration and fears about their own circumstances. And we drive those people.
Which, by the way, hold on. I just want to say here, this is one area where I'm not going to defend Trump, but I will point out that I do think he's touching something that is actually genuine. In other words, there is a valid reason that these people are pissed off. I think they're targeting it at the totally wrong object. But, this ties into that sort of Case Deaton study that we, stuff about the fact that sort of middle-class American whites not doing well at all. Go ahead.
Yeah. And there's nothing on the horizon that makes things a lot better for them in the near term is my worry, because their problems are structural. Their problems are not brought on by one. I mean, for in many ways, not always, but in many ways, not brought on by one political party or the other. And they're not frankly fixable by something anybody can do in the first 180 days. So yeah, they dissipate, but the frustration doesn't go away. And how does it get lit next time? And just, in thinking about the long-term health of a society, this is really not where you want to be.
No, that's true. Although, again, part of me wonders whether what we are witnessing, frankly, 1/5 of the American population has always felt like this. In some cases, a lot more than 1/5 of the American population has felt like this. And really, in some ways, it's like it bubbles up every once in a while and then it dissipates, which is to say, I don't know if this is any different from previous go-rounds. The one way in which it's different is that the guy making this noise is now leading the primary by most of the conventional polling things, and that's unusual. But I still don't think that's going to last. And then I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm with you in the sense of I want a society where these 20% actually winds up changing their minds, like, let's say, about some, much as the way that the public has shifted on things like gay marriage. But I'm not sure that's actually possible. This might be an irreducible problem, much like, in most other countries, there is probably 1/5 of the population that holds racist, xenophobic views, if not more so.
Yeah, no, it's certainly true that this is very parallel to what's happening in Europe.
Right.
But no, I mean, so I want to agree violently with Lindsey Graham, who drawing from the point you made, Dan, who said, this kind of rhetoric puts translators and embassy personnel and everybody that works with the U.S. military around the world at greater risk. And, you're right. Nobody's going to flip from liking the U.S. to wanting to go out and blow himself up because of one remark by Donald Trump. But if you imagine the highlight reel that ISIS is showing to recruits or that's being sent out on social media, and, there's nobody there to tell the 19-year-old sitting in his parents' basement in Belgium or London or Dagestan, this Donald Trump guy, the good thing is the American system worked and he won't go anywhere. He'll fade after Iowa. So
no, I think right now, let me put it this way, I cannot dispute that right now is the strongest moment for you to make this argument. I am hopeful, and this ties into something we'll talk about in a little bit, that 6 months from now we won't be having to talk about this. But that's a fair point that right now, yeah, this obviously I agree with you and Lindsey Graham.
Well, that's an excellent pivot, maybe, to our 2015-2016 conversation.
Well, no. I want to talk about the internet first, because that actually ties into Donald Trump. Because as I've been blogging, one of the problems about Trump is that Trump's racism and fascism mask his utter stupidity on other issues. It's a very clever tactic of his that way, but it drives me nuts. So in the same South Carolina speech where he talks about, right after he called for banning all Muslims. And by the way, can we just take a moment to appreciate the just abject stupidity of trying to implement that policy, much less the fact that it's illegal and immoral. I really, it's a breathtakingly stupid suggestion. But, an additional breathtakingly stupid suggestion that Trump made was that there's a problem with the internet because it leads to, ISIS and the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are using the internet to recruit people, and that Donald Trump suggested, we got to talk to people like Bill Gates and figure out a way to maybe shut down that part of the internet. And then he said, he then very clearly said, everyone's going to say freedom of speech. Oh, no. I'm willing to speak like it is. Which again also came off as stupid, except the interesting thing is that Trump was a second mover on that issue, because 24 hours earlier, Hillary Clinton gave a speech that actually in content sounded awfully similar to Donald Trump, and that she also talked about encouraging Silicon Valley people to find ways to disrupt the internet, and immediately addressed the notion of, some people protest freedom of speech, and you know what, we still have to do something like this. And so I get disturbed when there's not that much of a difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on issues, and I was curious about your take on this.
Well, first of all, that's such a slate pitchy take that you just offered there, because as you say, Trump's take was, we've got to talk to Bill Gates about shutting down the internet. And Clinton's take was, we've got to talk to Silicon Valley. Clinton, who knows that Bill Gates doesn't sit in Silicon Valley and isn't running a company anymore, and disrupt radicals' ability to use the internet to organize and radicalize. So, some of the same words were in the sentence, but yeah, I call slate pitch on that one.
Okay.
I will also, I've been kind of driving myself nuts on the cyber security and cyber radicalization issues, because there are so very few people who actually understand what they're talking about, and so very many people opining on it.
Yeah, I'm in the latter camp, just for the record. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So when you mentioned that you wanted to make this one of our topics today, I thought it's a really good opportunity for us to model sort of how pundits admit that they don't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. But I will also say that I did have the opportunity recently to talk to various people who know more than I do about it, sort of from the Intel community and the Hill and the think tank world. And the reason Clinton said, we've got to talk to the companies, is that there have been these talks and they've been very inconclusive, frankly, because all sides think they have more to gain by sticking to their positions than actually making a deal. Mm-hmm. So, the way people on the Hill talk about this is, everybody just comes up with their position paper. And there has not yet been the meeting of the minds on sort of what's the thing that we could actually do that would help. So I think, this is a case where political pronouncements are masking some sort of genuine frustration at the worker bee level. Mm-hmm. It was interesting. One of the guys I talked to compared it to child pornography. And he said, look, there were free speech concerns around that. And we eventually figured out ways to regulate and criminalize a big swath of problematic behavior. And he said, we're going to get there eventually, but we're not there yet.
That is a nice, sane, rational response, which I have to say makes me feel better. But I still can't quite part of this might be that Hillary Clinton used the word disrupt, which just drives me around the bend. And it's not Hillary Clinton's fault. It's this whole – so I'm working on this book now about the sort of changing market of foreign policy ideas in the U.S. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the Silicon Valleyization of the discourse, which includes the word disruption, which is to say, if you want to call slate pitch on me for what I did, I want to call slate pitch on anyone that uses the word disruption to describe what their foreign policy is going to be, because it's just a load of crap. And indeed, I think one of the more productive exchanges over the last year and a half has been, in fact, this sort of challenging of the management theory of disruptive innovation that Clayton Christensen made about 20 years ago and that Jill Lepore started tackling last year. And you're now seeing a much more fruitful exchange of ideas on, actually. I thereby propose, what I call Drezner's rule, modestly enough, which says anytime a politician appropriates a Silicon Valley buzzword, it indicates that buzzword is actually meaningless in terms of its content. So let me put it this way. What you say is perfectly fine. I'm willing to accept the notion that there are ways in which private companies can cooperate with the government to regulate the internet in such a way as to mute the possibility of extremist, radical, violence-inducing dialogue without, trampling on the First Amendment. But just please, let's not use the word disrupt.
Yeah, well, and I'll also say, I think it's very reasonable that this topic should make you anxious, right? I mean, yeah. And I'll say that I noticed just before we got on this morning in the FBI Director Comey's testimony before Congress today, he says that the foiled attackers in Galveston, what is that, 2 years ago? Yeah. That on the morning of the attack, they communicated with someone who I guess is a known organizer in the Middle East 109 times, but we don't know what's in those emails or communications because they were encrypted.
Right.
Now, on the one hand, there's a couple of ripostes that one could make to that, which is, number one, had you guys even picked that out beforehand, would you in fact have been able to decrypt them and get the information fast enough, right. Yeah. Even if you were allowed to?
Exactly.
Number two, possibly the exchange of 109 communications by itself should have really given you most of the information you needed.
Hey, yeah, the metadata actually would have been useful. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think there's a way that any one of these individual instances can really get blown into allegedly having a preventive significance that it might not actually have had.
Right.
But at the same time, that's interesting that here's a person who knew enough to encrypt his messaging and actually was communicating something connected to the unusual thing he attempted to do later in the day. So, but the other thing that kind of drives me a little crazy is on the privacy side is that, our data is not even remotely private.
You mean from corporations
or
from
corporations.
The government?
Right. And okay. I just get frustrated at this sort of the tendency among a certain subset of the cyber community to think that sort of all corporate holdings of my data are fine and all government holdings of my data are bad.
This is actually and this, by the way, is the inverse of the European attitude about all of this, which is Europeans are far more comfortable with the government having their data, but extremely allergic to the idea of corporations having the data.
Yeah. So, just basically the whole construct of how much of our lives and our, fairly intimate aspects of our lives we entrust to forces over which we have no meaningful oversight at this particular juncture.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I don't know if you saw this. I tweeted this last night. I finally gave in last night and downloaded Microsoft 10 because my computer had been insisting on it essentially for the last 6 months, and I keep saying no. And finally last night I'm like, okay, I'm tired of the reminders. Here you go. And when I turned on my computer again, there was a sentence, literally there was just one sentence on a blue screen saying, all your files are in the same place. And it was like the most HAL 2001 sentence that just like totally freaked me the hell out. And then the problem was that sentence was there for like another 30 seconds before the computer finally started working. And I was thinking, oh God, I've finally done it. So yes, the idea that I'm a vulnerable to autonomic or autonomous, robotic processes is certainly a valid one.
But we do have, and I mean, this is a broader sort of problem of the regulatory state, right? That technology outside government is moving much faster than technology inside government for sort of understandable and probably not fixable reasons. So sort of no matter what level you think privacy ought to be set at, we have not at all as a society figured out how to maintain that, how to have a public sector that can meaningfully keep up with the private sector.
Yes.
Or whether that's even the right goal, frankly.
I suppose the only thing that makes me sleep better at night is the knowledge that as bad as the U.S. government is at this, I suspect it's still better than most other governments at dealing with this, just because there actually is at least some relationship between Washington and Silicon Valley. And also, I don't know if you read that Politico article, one of the myths with respect to cyber security concerns is the notion that other countries, have much greater offensive capabilities when the truth is the U.S. actually has far and away the greater cyber offensive capabilities. We're just not using them. And by the way, that's the right thing, because this opens up if you were to do so, it opens up an entire new can of worms. So, this is December. So, at least unfortunately, when you look at it in the short term, there are many ways in which to think this year stunk. But I think there are other ways in which you could point out there have actually been positive trends. I think I wrote a blog post right before Thanksgiving arguing the myriad ways in which the U.S. should actually be thankful for what's happened this year. But we should focus more, interestingly enough, on what the big events will be for the coming year. The two big things that I would focus on, interestingly enough, there are three things I would focus on, and two of them are happening this month, which is first the outcome of the Paris Climate Change Summit. To see whether or not there actually is a broad-based accord on trying to reduce CO2 emissions, because that's kind of important with the planet and everything. But I also think it's somewhat significant as a symbol or as an exemplar for the sort of global governance, which is to say that if you can actually get meaningful cooperation on climate change, then hey, maybe there are other issues on which you can have meaningful cooperation on, which would be nice. Particularly since I've written a book arguing that the system works. So it would be nice if that, for just a personal, selfish perspective, I would like to know that, in fact, the system continues to work, because I think that's the argument that I've made. The second event that will happen this month, I believe soon, will be the Fed's decision to start raising interest rates in the United States. And I think the interesting thing for the next year is the degree to which the Fed actually continues to raise interest rates and the extent to which the U.S. and the global economy reacts to that. And one thing, again, system working kind of thesis I would make is that one of the things I've been encouraged by over the last couple of months was that I think the Fed was inclined to raise rates back in September and then held off. And I think the reason they held off primarily was not about the United States, but was about the global economy. It was about fears of both European and Chinese economic weakness and the worry that raising rates in the United States would be sort of the tipping point for further instability. And they held off, and I think that was the wise thing to do. And so it's encouraging to know, in contrast to previous, Fed history, that this Fed might actually be at least somewhat cognizant of the international ramifications of what it does with respect to interest rates. So I'm modestly more optimistic about this process than I was a year ago. And then the third thing is the U.S. election and essentially, in some ways, what we were talking about before, which is whether Trump fades from view or not, and whether you have, what is essentially what looks like a more conventional election race or something more unusual, and then who wins, obviously.
So I'm going to predict that 2016 will be brought to you by implementation and the letter T. And on implementation, what I mean is I think there will be a climate deal of some kind later this month. The really interesting question is how good both the implementation of national commitments is and the implementation of funding developing country amelioration is. And, that's one where you really have to watch the difference between the pledges and the transfers. So
absolutely.
So I would point to that as implementation number one. Implementation number two is the Iran deal. We're now almost to the point where we are at the point where the Iranians have come clean about their past history. The IAEA has presented the report. So now we actually have to start implementing and moving forward, and we will see how that goes, and we will see how it is judged to go. So those are two pieces of implementation that have short-term and long-term security consequences in 2016. And then for T, I give you three societies that in different ways are trying to sustain or hang on to democratic gains under challenging circumstances that in each case will say a lot about the region they live in. And those three countries are Taiwan, which has a presidential election, which the pro-Beijing party is expected to lose. Turkey, which is facing massive both internal and external pressures, and Tunisia, which is facing even more massive internal and external pressures, but which at this point is a really, really bright light. It's both a really, really bright light and a really big worry in the region. Yeah. So then, just for fun and to throw in an extra T, we'll have the effort to ratify TTP and the effort to negotiate TTIP. So.
That was punny. I will throw in one other region, which I do think, again, actually was promising in 2015 and might even be more promising in 2016, which is I think you're seeing Latin America potentially drifting away from its experiment with Bolivarianism. You see that and sort of far left economic policies. You saw that in the Argentine elections. You certainly saw that in the Venezuelan parliamentary elections. It will be interesting to see in what direction Brazil moves, given that Dilma Rousseff is facing political difficulties, and whether or not a year from now you see Venezuela looking somewhat different in terms of its outlook than it is right now. There are obviously some countries where the sort of Bolivarian idea is still entrenched, namely Nicaragua and Bolivia, but I don't know if those countries are going to be doing terribly well either. So a Latin America that is, let's say, less hostile to the United States for ideological reasons, I think is a good thing for the United States. So, hopefully that will be promising.
Yeah, I do think the question there is, as various countries go through transitions, how smooth are they able to be? How much support from outside are they able to get to help make them smooth versus does this turn into actually a creator of more instability? I think, certainly one worries about how the transition in Venezuela actually happens. But never fear, we'll be back to talk about all of that. So happy holidays and Happy New Year.
Happy holidays, and I wish you a very hopeful and prosperous 2016, Heather.
And likewise, look forward to doing it with you.
Yes. Bye, blogging heads.